The house in the bottle Elliot Pierce had always been drawn to the strange and unusual. Whether it was a flea market on the outskirts of town or a hidden antique shop in the city, he couldn't resist the thrill of discovering something unique. So when he stumbled upon a dusty little store tucked between two towering brownstones, its hand-painted sign reading, "Curiosities and Collectibles," he felt an immediate pull to step inside. The store smelled of aged wood and mothballs, and every surface was covered in an eclectic array of objects. There were shelves filled with porcelain dolls, vintage clocks, tarnished silverware, and books with cracked leather spines. But what caught Elliot's eye was a glass dome in the corner of the shop, under which sat a bottle unlike any he'd ever seen. The bottle was large, its glass slightly clouded with age, and inside was a perfectly detailed model of an old Victorian house. The craftsmanship was exquisite, from the miniature shingles on the roof to the tiny shutters on each window. It was the kind of piece that seemed to demand attention, as if it had a story of its own. "Interested in that one?" came a voice from behind him. Elliot turned to see an older man in a faded vest and bow tie. His eyes were sharp, despite the deep wrinkles framing them. "Yeah," Elliot said. "It's incredible. How much?" The shopkeeper hesitated, rubbing his chin. "That's a unique piece. Came into my possession under peculiar circumstances. I'll let it go for $50, but I'll warn you, it's not just a decoration." Elliot smirked. "What do you mean? Is it cursed or something?" The shopkeeper didn't laugh. "Something like that. Just treat it with care." Elliot handed over the cash and left the shop, feeling a strange mix of excitement and unease. The bottle was heavy in his hands as he carried it home, its contents casting warped shadows on the walls as he passed under streetlights. That night, Elliot placed the bottle on his mantel, admiring the way the soft glow of his living room lamp illuminated the tiny house inside. He noticed details he hadn't seen before: a cobblestone pathway leading to the front door, a wooden swing hanging from a tree in the yard, and even a tiny bird bath. It was almost too perfect. He went to bed feeling satisfied with his purchase, but his sleep was restless. He dreamed of the house in the bottle, except it wasn't tiny anymore. It loomed over him, its windows glowing with a warm, flickering light. He heard faint laughter and the creak of footsteps on wooden floors. When he woke up, the dream lingered in his mind. Shaking it off, he walked into the living room and froze. The tiny house inside the bottle was no longer as he remembered it. The front door, which had been closed the night before, was now slightly ajar. A faint light emanated from within, barely noticeable in the morning sun. Elliot frowned, leaning closer to the bottle. "Weird," he muttered. He figured it was a trick of the light or a detail he hadn't noticed before. But as the day went on, the memory of the open door gnawed at him. That evening, he couldn't resist inspecting the bottle again. The door was still ajar, and now, faintly visible through the tiny windows, were shadows moving inside. Elliot's breath caught. He tapped the glass of the bottle lightly, and the shadows stilled. "What the hell?" he whispered. The next few nights, the activity inside the bottle grew more pronounced. Elliot began to notice tiny figures moving about the house. They were humanoid, but their features were too small to make out. He would watch, transfixed, as they went about their business, lighting candles, setting tiny tables, and even sweeping the floors. It was like watching a dollhouse come to life. Then came the noises. At first it was faint, the creak of floorboards, the distant murmur of voices. But soon the sounds grew louder, more distinct. Laughter echoed from the bottle, high-pitched and eerie. Elliot began to feel like he wasn't alone, even when he was sitting in the room by himself. One night, as he watched the figures in the bottle, he saw something that made his blood run cold. One of the tiny figures turned toward him, its head tilting upward as if it were looking directly at him. Though its face was too small to discern, Elliot felt an undeniable sense of malice emanating from it. He stumbled back, knocking over a lamp in his haste. The sound of shattering glass brought him back to reality, and when he looked again, the figure was gone. Things took a darker turn after that. Elliot began to find objects in his apartment move from their usual places. A picture frame that had been on the mantel was now on the coffee table. The salt shaker from his kitchen was inexplicably in the bathroom. At first, he thought he was losing his mind, but deep down, he knew it was connected to the bottle. The final straw came when he woke up in the middle of the night to find one of the tiny figures standing on his nightstand. It was no longer confined to the bottle. The figure was small, no taller than 6 inches, but its presence was suffocating. Its blank face seemed to radiate malice as it stared at him. Elliot screamed, swatting at the figure, but it darted out of reach with unnatural speed, disappearing into the shadows of his room. He turned on every light, his heart racing, but the figure was gone. When he checked the bottle, the house was dark, its tiny inhabitants nowhere to be seen. Desperate, Elliot returned to the antique shop the next morning, bottle in hand. But the shop was gone. In its place was an empty storefront, the windows covered in dust. He asked around, but no one remembered a shop ever being there. With no other options, Elliot decided to destroy the bottle. He took it to an empty lot and smashed it against the ground. The glass shattered and the tiny house crumbled into pieces. For a moment, he felt relief, but as he turned to leave, he noticed something in the shadows of the lot. Figures, no longer tiny, were watching him. Their blank faces and malevolent presence were unmistakable. Elliot ran, but he knew it was futile. The house in the bottle was gone, but its inhabitants were free, and they were coming for him. For days, Elliot's life became a nightmare. No matter where he went, he felt their presence. At first, they lingered at the edges of his vision, silent and unmoving. But as time passed, they grew bolder, appearing in reflections, standing at the end of dark hallways, or even casting faint shadows in rooms where no one should be. One evening, after days without sleep, Elliot heard faint knocking at his door. He froze, staring at the doorknob as it twisted ever so slightly. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, until it sounded like dozens of fists pounding against the wood. Suddenly, it stopped. Summoning his courage, Elliot crept to the door and looked through the peephole. The hallway outside was empty, but when he turned back to the room, they were there, a sea of blank faces staring at him, their malice palpable. The air grew heavy, pressing down on his chest as the figures stepped closer. Elliot's screams echoed into the night, swallowed by the silence of the shadows that consumed him. The next day, his apartment was empty, save for a single object on the mantel. A pristine bottle containing a miniature Victorian house, its windows glowing faintly in the dark.